Thanks, Owen. There's much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. From Beijing, Xindo Xu is a senior fellow and political analyst at the Pangoal Institution. Here with us in the studio, John Sitilides. He's a global risk analyst, principal with Trilogy Advisors. From Los Angeles, global business executive Ryan Patel. And also in our studio is Jonathan Broder, a senior writer for Newsweek. Welcome all. Let's go to Beijing first of all. Xindo Xu, we saw these high-level talks that had been postponed on the diplomatic and security dialogue on Friday. Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States, is going to be filling in for Donald Trump in Asia this week. Are we seeing a thaw between Beijing and Washington, or is it still just a diplomatic dance?
Well, I would say there are signs of both sides, Washington and Beijing, somehow, as a Chinese scholar calls it, like a correction of their relationship because it's kind of going extreme in terms of rising tension between the two powers. Now, both sides see the need to stabilize the relationship. That's why you see the resumption of this diplomatic and security dialogue in Washington. And both sides say, like, military cooperation is important, and to avoid the near miss, almost like a military conflict in the South China Sea. Both sides, neither of them want to have a military conflict or want to have, not mentioning a war in South China Sea or over Taiwan. So people, after the phone conversation between the two leaders, President Xi Jinping and President Trump, we do see more positive signs of bringing the relationship back on track.
Xindo, thank you. John, slightly positive there, but we've got Mike Pence on his way into Asia, if not there already. He's been pretty tough on China. He gave this Hudson Institute speech at the conservative think tank. There was an op-ed in the Washington Post on Monday. Very much sort of Cold War thinking. People are calling it sort of a Mr. X article for a new Cold War. Is that going to be the message in APEC and elsewhere, or do you think there's going to be a calming of tensions?
I think calming of tensions is the goal. I don't know if it's achievable right now. And I think there's a fundamental disagreement between the United States and China as to what constitutes, for instance, freedom of navigation and sovereignty in the South China Sea. And as long as the U.S. and China don't agree on those definitions, I'm afraid we're going to see more of the kinds of tensions that we saw with this near collision of the warships. If China intends to declare an air defense identification zone over its exclusive economic zone in waters that the U.S. and the rest of the world do not recognize, but if they go in that direction, I think we're going to see very serious diplomatic tensions in addition to military escalation potentially in the region. And then we still have to balance all the areas where we want to cooperate with China on Korea denuclearization, on counterterrorism, and of course, a resolution of these trade disputes.
Yeah, Jonathan, what's your take? You've been covering the region for a very long time. Let's get your 30,000-foot view of where the U.S.-China relationship is now, because it's very different. China's celebrating 40 years of reform and opening up. Very different from 40 years ago.
Yes, well, I agree with John. I think that there are fundamental differences on many, many, many issues. Not only freedom of navigation, but also on trade and also on Korea. I mean, the United States and China really view how to proceed on Korea very, very differently. The Chinese want to go slowly, have a more gradual approach. From what we see of the administration, they want this to be resolved very, very quickly. Trump is quite impatient about and very absolute about what he wants the North Koreans to do.
Yes, it's because they both agree that a denuclearized Korean peninsula is the end game, but it's how to get there.
Exactly, it's how to get there.
And China has always said, even before this Trump deal, that they want sort of a reciprocal arrangement where the DPRK gives something and sanctions get lifted incrementally. But that's still not the U.S. position, even though the position seems a little bit more...
No, the United States position is we are now entering into these talks with you. You have to basically give up everything first, and then we will, lift sanctions. There's a very high bar for the North Koreans to meet in terms of the U.S. demands.
I just want to go a bit deeper. Do you see the U.S. sort of moving towards Beijing's position on this? I mean, the John Bolton all or nothing tactic doesn't seem to have worked, and the region seems to be moving on, including the Republic of Korea, saying, look, let's get this give and take.
It really depends who you talk to. I mean, there are different camps in the United States. There's the Bolton camp, which is very, very absolutist. There's Mark Pottinger in the National Security Council, who is underneath Bolton, but not quite as hardline as he is. And then, of course, there's folks in the Pentagon and the State Department. who have their own views on this. So there isn't really a unified U.S. position on
Yeah,
this.
I think you're absolutely right, not just on DPRK, but in a lot of things,
Yes.
China is having a real problem and working out how to deal with. They've admitted it openly as much. Ryan, that extends, doesn't it, to the economic sphere. Let's talk about the trade war. What was really interesting is we've seen sort of indications from the president that there seems to be some sort of wiggle room going into the G20 in Buenos Aires. But I don't know if anyone picked up on the CSIS speech of Peter Navarro, the trade and manufacturing advisor, over the weekend, on Friday, which was basically saying completely the opposite. There seems to be a real difference here. Where do you think U.S. policy and Beijing policy is going towards the trade war? Are we looking at a deal?
Well, they're looking at the G20 to kick this off as a starter. I don't know it's going to get done to that point. And I did see Peter Navarro's comments. I mean, he also said that he's not in the middle of the negotiating this, and it's going to be Trump going to actually close this deal. So I think for many months, I think we've talked about this on this program before, that I feel like this was setting up for the G20 for Trump to come in as, again, I don't know if it's going to close the deal, but as to push it to the right rhetoric. And I think that's why you're starting to see this rhetoric come out with the delegation, so they can have a positive meeting, because we all know that for businesses and for both heads of state, you need to have a positive meeting coming out of the G20. Imagine if it went the opposite direction with both of them meeting in person.
I think that's an excellent point. Shindo, can you put up for that? The stakes are high for Washington, but also for Beijing. Do they meet and not have a deal? And what could a possible deal look like, Shindo?
Well, I think if there's a deal, there could be a framework agreement reached by the two leaders that they can agree on the resumption of the negotiation. Both teams can resume their function and to talk about the differences. And secondly, I think the Chinese side can make some promises, even concessions, like to further opening up the market and increase the market access and reform some of the measures to better protect intellectual property rights. In response, I think the U.S. side can encourage, make promises like the U.S. will continue to encourage its companies to invest in China and also continue to export to China in terms of technology. And also, of course, also China could promise to purchase more U.S. stuff, more soybean, more wheat, more oil and gas to help narrow the gap. I think that's quite a good start, and then we can iron out the differences there.
Shindo, though, that deal was on the table, wasn't it? And it was rejected. Has China moved on a little bit? I mean, obviously, we had the Shanghai Import Expo, which was a sort of chance to show what else China is doing to address some of the U.S. concerns. We've seen also the deal with American Express, the first big financial company to go into the Chinese market coming up. Are these the sort of things that President Xi and President Trump can sort of show in terms of progress?
I think so. I think President Xi will explain to President Trump look, a lot of the requirement, a lot of the demands from the U.S. side actually is in line with the Chinese reform and opening up. The only thing I think Washington is not that patient, saying that you have been waiting for too long time and you are not making enough progress. You are not making enough progress quick enough. So I think the Chinese side, you can see over this year in particular, a lot of progresses, a lot of reforming measures. It's really about implementation. I think you do see the market is being opened further and also reforming measures is being implemented. I think President Xi can present all the evidence, all the progress to President Trump to convince him that China's road ahead is actually in line with the U.S. demands. China want to be a market-based economy, want to cooperate with the United States. Also, it represents a huge opportunity for the U.S. companies.
John, President Trump always styles himself as a deal maker. Is it time to make a deal? We just had the midterms. I was actually on a road trip in Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Pennsylvania recently, and I was surprised by two things. One, how much time people who are suffering under tariffs are willing to give Trump, quite a long time actually, and also how much actually the pain is already hurting. Is this time to make a deal in terms of Trump when he looks to re-election? He can't really win the White House without at least one or two of those states.
It's a very important point that you raise. It might be a little bit on the early side. I think President Trump feels that there may be more pain to be extracted on the Chinese side before there's a serious agreement.
But what about the pain here? Because it's getting pretty bad, isn't it?
I understand that, but his voters are very loyal to him. And if they're willing to see that there's daylight at the end of this tunnel, so to speak, They may be willing to stick with him quite a bit longer. I don't think they really trust any other politician to extract the kinds of concessions from China that Trump seems to be willing to make. But I think there's a larger equation here also. One is clearly he's going to run for re-election, and so how does he ensure he maintains that electoral bloc that brought him into the White House to begin with?
Only 70,000 votes in 3 of those states I mentioned, so it was really close.
So razor-thin margin. But I think also on a policy level, I think the White House is very serious about how to possibly link progress on trade to progress on denuclearization of North Korea, and also the South China Sea issues. These are not compartmentalized issues. And I think the White House will look to see how they balance up and down. Where there's progress in one, is there progress on the other? And if not, how do you hold back until you get progress in the area that you're looking for progress on?
Interesting. Jonathan, Democrats just took the House. Is there going to be any difference in terms of policy towards China, do you think?
I don't think so. I think that, on trade, the administration has executive power. The Congress really doesn't really have that much to say about trade. So the president can pursue his trade policies really without congressional interference or whatever. But also you have to remember that on the issue of China, Democrats are, I think, more in favor of protectionism than the Republicans. And Republicans, of course, are hardline on when it comes to confronting China on security issues. So there's a bit of an overlap in terms of support for Trump within Congress. I'd just like to add one thing.
Of course.
You talked about the pain that people are experiencing out in the Midwest. Up until now, it has been mainly soybean farmers and the agricultural sector. And as you said, John, there are people who are willing to give Trump more time. Also, he provided them with $12 billion to sort of tide them over in the meantime, right?
Good point.
That's going to, there's a limit to how long and how much money the United States has to buy off the soybean farmers. But there's another area now. A lot of American automobiles from American automobile companies like General Motors, Ford, are made in China.
At least 40 to 50% of them. Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
Right. And those exports to the States are going to, the automobile companies have said they are going to stop bringing over these made-in-China cars to the United States. That's going to hurt.
Yeah, actually, I have some figures on that. There's only about 160,000 cars that actually come from China,
Yeah.
fully made, but the parts are very important.
Yes.
And that's where a lot of the tariffs are. And the cost of a car could actually go up between, they're reckoning about, these are experts in Detroit, not me talking,
Yes.
$700 to $1,000
Actually,
initially.
more than that.
Yeah, and it depends. If you're buying an F-150 or something, it'd be even more.
Right.
So this, I want to put this to Ryan. You're out on the West Coast. You know, obviously, it's not just Michigan that's looking at this. It's also Silicon Valley, the whole huge China market, the market for services going forward. Does there need to be a breakthrough soon? Because the U.S. economy is doing okay.
Yeah, the economy is doing okay. I think you're going to start the consumers. Here's what people understand. When the supply chain, like you were mentioning, that's where, when it starts from the beginning to the sourcing to all the way to the end product, the consumers at the end of the day will get affected. And when companies and the consumers can't spend as much, companies' margins are starting to actually decrease. And I think by the end of this year, going into next year, you really start to see it in the numbers a little bit, and that's when you'll see a lot more pressure. Obviously, we were talking about how Congress can't put pressure on the administration about trade policy, but I can assure you, companies and consumers and the citizens can. And when that starts to hit the pocket, that is where I think that nervousness of both sides, both China and the U.S., for both its citizens, trying to make a deal becomes really, really important. And the West Coast, obviously, being kind of a focal point to ensure that they get their products at a price where they can still be competitive and have enough supply and demand.
Thanks. Shindo, President Trump almost sort of displays this sometimes as a game of chicken. Who's going to blink first? He often talks about the fact how the Chinese stock market has been down, how the U.S. economy is doing great, so therefore the U.S. can endure pain. Is China going through pain because of these tariffs? I just looked at Singles Day, for example, the big Alibaba and everyone's shopping day. That broke records. So what's going on here?
Well, there are obviously some companies like export-oriented, especially if they are exporting to the U.S., it's affected to a certain degree. But look, there are problems with the Chinese economy. It's really about homemade. It's not because of the trade war between the two countries. For example, in the private sector, that's the state policy to reduce this overcapacity, so-called deleveraging, and somehow putting the private sector in a very difficult position to secure loans and to sustain their business. Sometimes they are selling their best assets to the state-owned companies. So there's a lot of complaint. And you see the Chinese government is fixing this problem. But it's not from the trade war with the U.S. I think it's really about the Chinese economy. Now it's in the low point. But if you look at the Chinese market, stock market, if you look at the new policies out of the central government, people have a strong belief, at the end of this year or next year, Chinese economy will be roaring again. And look, I mean, next year or in the middle of next year, U.S. economy, we will see whether will continue like this, especially when the central bank is to increase the rates, and also this tax reduction, the effects will be probably marginal and continue to be reduced. So it's really about the competition of economy, but that's fine. But the U.S.-China problem is beyond that. That's worrying. Attacks against the Chinese political system. But look, it's very different from the U.S. People might don't like it, but that doesn't matter. This political system has brought China from a very poor country to the second largest economy. And the Chinese people are fine with it. If you look at, hundreds of thousands of young Chinese going overseas to study, to work, and after graduation, the majority of them are coming back to China. If Chinese society is not that good, why they are coming back? People should respect the Chinese system, Chinese sovereignty, like over Taiwan in the South China Sea. Two countries can talk about that. Chinese claim is not the whole China Sea, as often reported in the Western media. No, Chinese official policy is the islands and the surrounding waters. The open sea is open sea. It's not Chinese sea. So I think people should take a hard look, closer look, and make a difference over there.
John, how do you respond to that? Because there has a feeling in Beijing, which I think Shindo sort of articulated there, that we've moved to the US from a period of cooperation when it comes to things like climate, but competition when it comes to sort of the businesses of tomorrow. That was sort of the Obama administration. You could compete and cooperate where it matters, to just straight out great power competition. Is that essentially where the Trump administration is? Is this essentially a new Cold War for the 21st century?
I don't want to go into Cold War territory yet, and I hope that we never arrive there.
But the rhetoric is there.
But I think Vice President Mike Pence made very clear that there is a different optic through which the United States views the relationship with China, and the areas to which there is going to be cooperation. I think we all want to advance that as much as possible, but there are going to be areas of strategic competition. And this is not just a bilateral U.S.-China issue. There are many countries in Southeast Asia that are also concerned about what's happening in the South China Sea. And it's no accident in the days ahead, we'll see a reformation of what's known as the quadrilateral.
Oh, by the way, I've studied it quite a lot. It's not there. It really isn't. It really isn't there. You're just for our audience, you're talking about Australia, Japan, India, and the US acting as some sort of security alliance. Delhi really doesn't like this at the moment, and there are differences even in Canberra and Tokyo. No, I get where you're going, because that's the vision, the free and open Indo-Pacific.
The perceptions are there.
But
now, if the perceptions are inaccurate, that time will tell. But the perceptions are there, and there are these larger security issues that are very much prominent in the U.S. thinking right now. And the South China Sea is going to be a significant area of contention because it's such an important waterway, not only for China, but also for all of the Pacific Rim countries. And the principles there apply to freedom of navigation around the world.
Sure. And Shindo made that point, though, that China does have territorial claims on these islands. Vietnam does, Philippines, others.
Yes.
But it's usually sort of the 12 nautical mile and then the EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, that can come out of some of them, depending if they're populatable. It's very complicated, the UN law of the sea, as we know. But what I'm saying is they've never said, this is our lake. This is still going to be an international waterway, depending on whatever sovereignty arguments, whoever gets their sovereignty claims.
If that's the case, I think we're heading towards an easier resolution of the differences in place. There are others who talk about the 9-dash line and sovereignty claims that may consume as much as 80% of the South China Sea. So that becomes worrisome because we have to address a whole series of multilateral security issues in the area. And that's going to be, I think, a very prominent area for hopefully not competition, but cooperation and obviously continued dialogue towards that cooperation down the road.
Jonathan, we haven't mentioned Taiwan yet. It has been a flashpoint for decades in terms of U.S. China relations. We've had some very big arms sales recently to the island of Taiwan. There have been some noises from John Bolton's lot that perhaps they want to get behind a little bit more pro-independence talk. There's more officials potentially visiting. This is the flashpoint, isn't it? It doesn't always get reported much in Washington, but this is potentially the flashpoint between Washington and
Yes,
Beijing.
I mean, China has very often described this as a core issue for them, which
Red
means
line.
that yes, they will go to war over this, and we've seen buildup of Chinese military forces just across the strait in Fujian. The United States is poking them a bit. I mean, they ran a couple destroyers down the Taiwan Straits not too long ago, and there's plans to bring a carrier battle group down the Straits as well.
Which is, I mean, that was meant to have happened and then delayed, and there's all
Yes,
this,
but it's still out there. Right. And Congress passed a law recently that will upgrade the level of official contacts between the United States and Taiwan. This is dangerous stuff, I think. And to get to something that you said, John, I know that the administration would like to sort of use trade as a lever or for leverage on North Korea or on other issues. I don't know that the Chinese are going to be willing to play that game. It's not clear to me that the Chinese will agree to make a concession on trade in order to make progress on North Korea. That's not the game. There are two games being played here, and my fear is that each side is not playing the same game.
Shindo, can you follow up on that and respond to the Taiwan issues that's been raised?
Right. The Taiwan issue, as earlier speaker mentioned, that's the true core interest of China. It's about the sovereignty. It's about the territorial integrity. There's no way for China to step back even for an inch, I can assure you. If Taiwan declares independence, then there's a war, and that's 100%. So I think I just do hope that Washington understands clearly. There's a red line, there's a bottom line. And continuous support, especially military support and the diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, you cannot break the limit. Otherwise, there will be a danger between China and the U.S. That's the only real area, I would say, so far that could see a war. And in terms of like a Korean Peninsula issue, if you look at the Chinese position, it's very similar to that of South Korea, to that of Russia. They are very similar. Asian people, they understand that you have to show respect for the North Koreans. You have to make some concessions and then ask them to make concessions. Then everybody step back a little bit, and then we will reach agreement. And now Washington is asked for the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons, and then I will start to talk to you. I think it's impossible to be successful, that policy.
Shindo, thanks. Ryan, I'm going to let you finish because you're in sunny California. There's optimism there. I can feel it.
Well, there's a lot of fires right now going on. So
that's true. But
we're getting there.
In terms of the economic outlook for a potential deal between Beijing and Washington at the end of this month, beginning of December, are you optimistic? What are you hearing from people in the investment community?
Yeah, I think there's optimism in a way that we're going to hopefully move forward. I don't think everyone's kind of buckling down. That may go longer. I think the word that or the phrase I would use is the deal that's going to strike is cooperation with competition. And what I mean by that is there's going to be a deal, there has to be a deal in place that puts both sides happy enough to where they go, okay, we're going to kind of go after each other in the economic terms. There is going to be a partnership, don't get me wrong, but I think, when you see the American, I think the American Express deal was really, really important because I think it gets some U.S. companies who've been waiting in this process and these reforms to get into the country and have some kind of either joint venture to that degree can be a dangling for the U.S. to come together and China to come together and say, well, this is what we'll do on this side from that side as well.
Okay, last word, Jonathan, because you had your finger up.
Don't forget that the person that we're dealing with here is Donald Trump. This is not a normal situation. Donald Trump does not see diplomacy as a win-win proposition. He sees it as a zero-sum proposition. And it's very, very possible, just be prepared that after Argentina, there could be no agreement. It could break down in Argentina.
Well, on that pessimistic note, I think we're going to have to leave it. I
Yeah.
mean, I think you're right. Glass half full, glass half empty, and either could be true. I mean, it's very opaque at the moment. John, Jonathan, Shindo, Ryan, thanks so much for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. But the conversation does continue online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us. See you soon.